Institute of Security Studies, and we chat to her now on the telephone. Good afternoon, Stephanie. Apologies for the problem with our Skype connection earlier on.
No problem. Good afternoon.
Will more boots on the ground help resolve the unfolding crisis we see in Burundi right now, Stephanie?
No, not really. I think, this suggestion that UN troops should be deployed to the Burundi is really a question of measure of last resort. What we are hoping will happen before then is that there will be a resumption of the internationally mediated dialogue, which is being led by Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, which has never really started, but which is an essential step in trying to restore some level of peace and stability to Burundi. The question of deploying a force there now is really, I think, something that the United Nations is concerned about doing, because there is an increasing risk that the political crisis that has now been dragging on for 7 months could at some point turn into an all-out civil war. And of course, that's something that we all want to prevent. And I think that's where this particular question of the deployment comes in.
Yes, and it's almost 7 months ago now that we saw the coup by Pierre Nkurunziza, against Pierre Nkurunziza, that is, and then he returned home. But he wouldn't have been able to return without the support of some East African states, at least, and the international community. So how much of regional support does he really enjoy now?
Well, I think, as you say, he couldn't have come home without the support of the international community and the regional community. But of course, in Africa, coups d'etats have become unacceptable. And so that wouldn't have been a solution to what was then the early stages of the political crisis in Burundi. The regional body, the East African community, then chose to say to Nkurunziza, why don't you delay the elections for a certain period, which he did, but by a very short time. It was only delayed by 2 weeks. At the end of the day, we have an outcome of that election in July with Nkurunziza emerging as the victor, the opposition, of course, boycotting. And I think there was a sense in the international community that, okay, it wasn't an ideal solution, but we had to move on from there. And the EU and other key international bodies, the African Union as well, and the EAC, were trying to engage the Nkurunziza government and saying to them things like, you must restore freedom of expression, allow the independent media to come back on air, allow human rights activists and politicians to move freely and to express themselves freely. And instead of seeing that, what we've seen is a further crackdown on human rights activists, on politicians. We've seen murders, we've seen killings, we've seen a growing number of security forces, parallel security forces that are not the official police and not the official military. So a worsening of the security situation and of the attitude of the Nkurunziza government. And this is what has rendered this crisis even more acute.
Stephanie, let's quickly talk about the regional implications for a moment. What does this year's election in Burundi, what does it mean with regard to Paul Kagame's potential bid for third term in 2017? And will we see Rwanda intervene in Burundi if the conflict escalates further? We do know that the Rwandans must be watching closely.
Yes, as you rightly say, the Rwandans are watching very closely, and the Burundians are watching Rwanda very closely, and it is a very tense time between the two neighbors. Especially as there are growing allegations that the Rwandan government is backing the Burundian opposition, and there are growing allegations by the Burundian government that the opposition is now an armed opposition. So the conversation is now about whether or not the opposition is an armed opposition, in other words, a rebellion, and whether it is being backed by Rwanda and whether it will attack Burundi. And I think that is also a concern where the question of these UN troops might come in as some kind of buffer or a deterrent to that kind of an escalation. But yes, the situation is very tense. Now, when it comes to Kagame's mandate, I think that, of course, it isn't ideal for him that the neighbor next door has, under very different circumstances, also extended his mandate, and that the country there has descended into this kind of chaos. Of course, Kagame's argument is that he is being asked to stay on by his population, and he has the petition and the 4 million signatures to show for it. So he argues that his situation is very different. There's no illegality to it, and in fact, there is popular support for him to stay on.
Stephanie Wolters, thank you so much for your time on the SABC News Desk. Ms. Wolters is the head of Conflict Prevention and Risk Analysis at the Institute of Security Studies. Time for some sport.